I take advantage of the reconstruction to briefly introduce the embryonic circulatory system and the way how oxygen is supplied to the embryonic tissues, body walls, and different organs of this embryo. These are the trachea and lungs. And if I start with this, it is to stress the fact that in utero, the lungs are not functional. So what we see here is the left lung, the cavities of the left lung, the cavities of the right lung, and the cavity, the lumen of the trachea. The function of respiration is instead carried out in the placenta. In other words, the embryo receives its oxygen supply across the placenta, to which oxygen is delivered through maternal blood. Now, at this stage of development, the trachea lungs are an outgrowth of the primitive gut, which is represented here in dark green. You can perhaps recognize the stomach here and the midgut loop here. And this is the point of origin of the trachea, respiratory diverticulum, which gives rise to the trachea and lungs from the primitive gut. So the trachea and lungs are filled with fluid, they are not functional, and they are dispensable for life and will remain so until birth. We start the reconstruction by revealing the cavity of the primitive ventricle, which, as you can see here, is lined by a meshwork, or at least you can imagine it. It is lined by a meshwork of muscular bands called the trabecula carne. That's why the contours of this cavity are so irregular. Locally, these trabeculae have merged to form the muscular interventricular septum, which is localized here. So here, and which of course appears in negative, as the myocardium was not segmented. The cavities were segmented, not the myocardium. This septum incompletely separates the future left ventricle from the future right ventricle. Above this septum, the developing left and right ventricular chambers are still in open communication by way of the interventricular foramen. Now we can add to this cavity that of the primitive atrium, left lateral view, and then the atrioventricular canal, which is lined by two conspicuous masses of loosely arranged mesenchyme, the superior and inferior endocardial cushions. Inferior endocardial cushion, let me remove the primitive atrium. So inferior endocardial cushion and superior endocardial cushion. And we can also remove the primitive ventricle. So here note again that the lumen of the atrioventricular canal was not segmented, and it appears here in negative. So it is on the black background. We can now add to this the outflow tract, which is represented, so the outflow tract of the heart, which is represented as the atrioventricular canal in the form of its two endocardial cushions. So the outflow, the superior and inferior outflow tract endocardial cushion. Here on a left lateral view, here on a ventral view. So the superior is here and the inferior is here. Dorsal view. The heart is still incomplete as it lacks the venous pole. This venous pole is called the sinus venosus, and the sinus venosus is a channel here, this one, which communicates on the one hand with the atrium, with the primitive atrium, and on the other hand with the entire venous system. We see here that the sinus venosus has been segmented together with the two anterior cardinal veins, which are the systemic veins draining the anterior half of the embryo, ventral view, so mainly the head of the embryo. As you can see here. Likewise, the posterior cardinal veins, which was segmented separately on each side of the midline, left posterior cardinal vein, right posterior cardinal vein, drain the posterior half of the embryo. Left lateral aspect, ventral aspect of the venous system. At the level of the heart, the cardinal veins, so anterior and posterior cardinal vein, unite to form a common channel, which is called the common cardinal veins, and the two common cardinal veins, left and right common cardinal vein, unite to form the sinus venosus. So the cardinal veins are the systemic veins that collect the blood distributed to the various organs and tissues of the body. For example, they receive a series of intersegmental veins from the body walls. So you can see this here in the anterior and posterior cardinal vein. All of them were not represented. So it is quite striking that at this developmental stage, the venous system, the systemic venous system to be precise, and only this one, is still bilaterally symmetrical. And as we will see in a moment, this is also the case for the arterial system. The anterior and posterior cardinal veins convey oxygen-depleted blood to the sinus venosus and thus to the heart. The sinus venosus also receives oxygenated blood from the placenta through the left umbilical vein. So note that at this stage of development, the right umbilical vein, which had the same caliber as the left vein at an earlier developmental stage, has already regressed. The left umbilical vein does not empty directly into the sinus venosus as it was the case at an earlier developmental stage. There is a gap here between the vein and the sinus venosus. It runs, this vein runs laterally to the body wall, in the body wall, then joins the ductus venosus. The ductus venosus is a channel that passes through the liver and ends, here is the ductus venosus, into the hepatocardiac vein. This vein here, hepatocardiac vein, will at a later stage give rise to part of the inferior vena cava. The hepatocardiac vein also receives the portal vein, which drains the gastrointestinal tract of this embryo, as well as numerous liver sinusoids. It empties into the right portion of the sinus venosus, thus bridging the gap between the left umbilical artery and the heart. Now, to orient yourself, I can display the liver. It is, and you see that the liver sinusoids and the ductus venosus are embedded in the mass of the liver. It is the dorsal aorta, its branches and capillary networks that distribute the blood to the various embryonic tissues. After putting this vessel on display, one can see immediately, and this is obvious on a superior view, that there is a gap between the dorsal aorta here and the outflow tract of the heart. Now, the connection is provided by the aortic sac. The aortic sac is a channel that makes the transition between the heart proper and the arterial system. The aortic sac yields a series of arteries which pass through the pharyngeal arches and are therefore called pharyngeal arch arteries, or also aortic arches. Here, the left and the right fourth aortic arches were segmented together with the aortic sac. So the aortic sac is here in the middle, and the two aortic arches are here, and one can see the connection of the fourth left aortic arch with the aortic sac, and of the fourth left aortic sac with the dorsal aorta. Note that the left and right dorsal aorta are separated in the region of the aortic arches. So left and right, and this is the midline dorsal aorta. Likewise, the third aortic arches, left and right, and the six aortic arches here, right and left, convey the blood from the aortic sac to the dorsal aorta. The blood from the aorta not only irrigates the embryonic tissues, but also, at least part of it, returns to the placenta thanks to the two umbilical arteries which originate from the caudal portion of the midline dorsal aorta. Here they are. And so this is the left umbilical artery, the right umbilical artery, which meets somewhere in the umbilical cord to form a single vessel. And I can show you from the outside the umbilical cord, which contain the umbilical arteries and the umbilical vein. In summary, the embryonic blood is oxygenated but also depleted from its metabolic waste products, including notably carbon dioxide, and at the same time it is enriched in nutrients in the placenta, which is not represented, of course. The blood then travels through the left umbilical vein, through the ductus venosus, through the hepatocardiac vein. It reaches the sinus venosus, then enters the primitive atrium, where it is mixed with oxygen-depleted blood coming from the systemic veins, the anterior cardinal veins and the posterior cardinal veins. The blood is then conveyed through the atrioventricular canal in the primitive ventricle and expelled with each beat of the ventricle in the heart outflow tract, in the aortic sac, and through the aortic arches into the dorsal aorta. It is carried out to the tissues by the various branches of the aorta. For example, here in the neck region, these branches are represented by the network of the internal carotid arteries. These branches give rise to capillary networks, which in turn merge into venules. So the capillary networks are not represented, but they are interposed between the arterial and venous system. These venous capillaries so merge into venules, then into large systemic veins, the anterior cardinal veins, for the anterior half of the embryo, so for the head region, responsible for returning the blood to the heart. Part of the blood present in the midline dorsal aorta returns to the placenta through the two umbilical arteries. For technical reasons, capillary networks were not represented here. If you are interested to see how these networks look like in mouse embryos and how they change with time, you may like these two papers. I thank you for your attention.